I will just introduce our speakers and then we will get started. So this is Scott Alexander. Scott wrote and writes Haskell Codex 10 and Slate Star Codex, which I think are possibly the most or one of the most respected single author blogs in this space and amongst this community. Scott also supports forecasting in terms of writing about it and the forecasting mini grants. And also he's written Unsong, which I consider just a terribly, terribly underrated piece of literature. It's just wonderful. I'd recommend it. So this is Scott Alexander. Please a round of applause. I don't know whether Scott considers himself a journalist. You know, they can get it if they want to. This is Dylan Matthews. Dylan writes for Vox and also is lead writer for their Future Perfect, which is kind of like an EA vertical. Dylan donated his kidney, which I respect him immensely. And last time I saw Dylan, we were at a robot warehouse party. I don't know why the owners of a robot warehouse let us in their robot warehouse. He lost his glasses. I think he's found them now. So again, a lovely round of applause for Dylan. I'll turn it over to that.
Thank you. Testing. Can you all hear? Is this a good volume? Good. Yeah, so thank you for coming. We originally had a very impressive journalism panel with Nate Silver and Clara Collier and many great people. Everyone dropped out except Dylan. So thank you for coming, Dylan. I'm kind of ambiguously sort of a journalist, maybe in like the Nietzschean he who fights with monsters must take care lest he become a monster sense. But apparently I'm here, and my thought was I'm going to ask Dylan some questions about journalism. He can ask me any questions that he comes up with, and then we'll open it to questions from the floor. So I wanted to start by asking, what you write Future Perfect, which is an amazing kind of EA-themed set of columns at Vox. What is the degree to which you use prediction markets for that? Or forecasting?
For forecasting. So we try to have it sort of institutionalized in some ways. So one thing we do is we do an annual list of predictions, very much ripped off from your annual list of predictions. And it's not quite as long, and we try to, I think, to sort of get a lay audience more acclimated to it, have like lengthier expositions of each thing we're predicting. But we've tried to do that every year. I don't think my Briar score has gotten noticeably lower. I think some of that is just they're doing things over a year span is hard, as you know, and I think probably the number of questions we're predicting is not quite high enough. I think in other cases it's very it's been useful just I'm sorry if this is peaking. I'll move it away. It's been useful for sort of in the midst of a breaking news moment. So when there's a midterm election, say, you don't know if John Fetterman or Mehmet Oz is going to win, like the best real-time indicator of where things are going is often Predicted or Manifold or Kalshi or well, no, Kalshi apparently as of today cannot have markets on U.S. elections, RIP. But so very useful in those contexts. Part of why I wanted to have this conversation is we probably don't use them enough, and I'm sort of curious how. This is something that I'm based in DC, and whenever I come out to the Bay, people ask me why we don't do forecasting enough. And it's a really foreign question in the milieu of DC journalism, and I think it's curious to think of the cases where that applies, and I think it particularly applies in kind of attempts to do analysis, which is most of what we do. Like if you're like a gumshoe investigative reporter trying to figure out what the CIA is up to, it's probably not super relevant unless you are like trying to bust them for working with Robin Hanson on something. But for what we do, it does seem relevant. And I mean, I wrote about the superconductor thing a few weeks ago. Very relevant there. I mean, it was sort of part of the story. Part of why it was exciting was that it was a moment for superconductors to be a place where like discourse around this happens. But yeah, I'm partly curious, and I know the format we agreed to is like you asking questions first and whatever. But I'm curious, like, if there are types of articles you wish would have more market input.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've described things that are very explicitly about prediction or forecasting, like your forecast or the article, which was great, by the way, on how the forecasting was affecting the discussion around the superconductor. And you've described like glancing at forecasts in the middle of doing something that isn't a forecasting article. And I'm wondering about things in between, like let's say just an article, not even necessarily on Future Perfect, but let's say Vox is running an article about the election. It does seem to me that like an interesting part of that would be including a prediction market saying Joe Biden currently has a 58% chance of winning, or even like Joe Biden gets caught in scandal, but look, his chances of winning are still at 58%. What makes people what makes it hard to include that kind of prediction or forecast?
Yeah, okay. So what are the things editors would say to me for why to not include that? So I think in an election context, you do have other sources of information, like namely polling. And I think the case for prediction markets gets more compelling as that gets hollowed out. So one, polling is going through a really bad crisis right now, as people have probably noticed. So I think that the main thing is that it used to be that you would dial people at home on their landlines. That's obviously no longer applicable. No one picks up from random callers on cell phones. You have to rely on these like online panels that are very unrepresentative, which makes the way that you weight really important. And there are some challenges you can't kind of overcome with weighting of maybe even the sort of low trust conservative people who reply to online panels are like meaningfully different from the ones who don't. The way David Shore, the pollster, has described this to me is that before 2016, there's always been like a gap in who replies to polls based on their level of social trust. If you ask people like, do you trust your neighbor generally? Like, can you leave your house unlocked? Do you think people generally are like out to get you or good intentioned? That's always been negatively correlated with whether someone will reply to a poll, which makes sense. Like, yeah, like the people who answered the phone and tell people like their opinions tend to be kind of trusting and amiable. It just didn't used to matter because there was no partisan division between those people and like super low trust individuals. And then like Donald Trump happened and there was suddenly a huge partisan cleavage between low trust and high trust individuals. And that turned out to be very, very, very important. Anyway, this is a long tangent on polling. Why do editors not like this? So I think a problem I would run into with Manifold is that it's play money. And so I think the intuition that a like play money market where resolution is arbitrary would arrive and equilibrate around roughly the right outcome is just like highly non-intuitive to the people I'm making this case to. It seems kind of like I'm sort of citing some hobbyists, which in a way you are, but like I think they're smart and I think they have some like useful data. I think I've had some success in getting like betting sites through. I remember when the Pope resigned, I like managed to get an article that was like trying to collate international like bookies estimates for which cardinal was going to be the next pope, because it seemed like the only non-speculative way to like think about it. And sure enough, those markets, like by far the leading contender was Bengoglio, who would become Pope Francis. So I think there's something about that feels a little more familiar, maybe because it's been normalized through sports coverage, through Oscar coverage. I think prediction markets feel a little more exotic. They feel a little more untested. And I think also there's just a space consideration. I don't have to explain what a poll is. People know what a poll is. 99% of our readers, and this is our readers, which is a more prediction market aware subset of Vox's readers, which I think is more prediction market aware than most of the media, have no idea what Manifold is or how it works, in part because it's like, what, a year old? And that's fair enough. But there's just sort of an understanding gap you have to get over there.
Yeah, so I guess
Sorry, can I just ask you to move your mic closer to your face? As close as possible.
As close as possible. Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
So I guess I was thinking of this originally as how do we get someone, let's say a journalist, interested in prediction markets? And it sounds like you're saying it's almost the Swiss cheese model of we need the journalist, the editor, the readers, and maybe a couple other people. And if they all allow the prediction market, then it gets through. Is that right?
I think there's a degree to that. Like you can push harder. Like you can get more cheese through if you push it harder into the thing. Like if I like really insist with editors, I can get it through. There's just like a degree of friction, and there's also a degree of uncertainty on my end of trying to think through articles that I've written recently where this would apply. I mean, there's large categories of articles where I don't feel like it's super relevant. A lot of what I do is writing up research, summarizing a study, talking to some experts in a given field, trying to sort of do an on-the-fly literature review. And I know there are prediction markets for like whether things will replicate or such, and those might occasionally be relevant, but a lot of times the way it works is there's a new paper, someone sends it to me a week before it comes out. I have some time to ask other experts who weren't directly involved in writing the paper what they make of it. It's not really clear to me where I integrate prediction markets into that. If you have ideas, I'm open to them.
I'm definitely not saying that you personally aren't doing this enough. I guess I'm more surprised that, let's say, the election reporters, the international events reporters, things like that. And how much of that is they personally have never heard of them and need to be convinced, or there are institutional reasons why it would be impossible even if they wanted to?
I would say maybe 70, 30, 70 for they've never heard of it, 30, there are institutional barriers. International events is an interesting case because like there's a real paucity of useful information. Often there's deference to intelligence agencies, but everyone knows that they get things wrong all the time. Like the consensus estimate of the US intelligence agencies was that the Ukrainians were going to lose within a month. Russian troops would be in Kiev. There's this one agency in the State Department that I've gotten sort of obsessed with, and maybe you could get them into prediction markets. They're called INR, which they're just like the little spy agency within the State Department. And they're famous for like getting big controversial questions consistently right when no one else does, and then no one ever listens to them ever again. So like I think like 1963, were writing, if we commit any troops in Vietnam, it's going to become like an unworkable quagmire, and there's no way that we can like prevent a takeover of the South by the North. In 2002, they were the only U.S. like intelligence community agency that was like adamant that Saddam Hussein did not have a chemical or biological weapons program. They were the only agency saying like the Ukrainian army is relatively strong and will be able to resist a Russian attack. I don't know the full bureaucratic reasons why no one listens to them. And it's also possible that they're just like really good at leaking when they get stuff right. And so like that's why I've heard all these stories of their like misbegotten triumph. But I do think like trying to win readers. So where I was going with that with international events is just I think moments like that where there isn't an alternative source like polling, there aren't past elections or other sort of data things you can pull in. It's not sports where I guess you sort of have prediction markets and that you have bookies, but you have like reams of analytics you can turn to. Will China invade Taiwan is not a question where there's lots of analytics, and seems sort of ideally suited for prediction markets to sort of add to people's understanding.
Yeah, so in this audience, we have people who run prediction markets, people who bet on prediction markets, people with media platforms. What are the top things that we could do or change to make it more likely that journalists would start looking into these kind of forecasts?
Sure. Send them over. I mean, it's not sufficient, but it starts. And I think some of this, I've gotten pitch emails from Manifold and Metaculus and stuff, and so some of this is already happening. But and it is a sort of drinking from a fire hose phenomenon where I get like 150 like PR people's emails every day, and it can be like hard to triage between them. And so you're going to blast those out to a lot of reporters. Most of them will ignore them, but some of them will read them. Some of them are like on deadline and really need a story to work on, and sometimes that's all you need. So I think like that's part of it. Meet reporters where they're at. A lot of other sort of sources of data and information that reporters use, think tanks, agencies like the Census or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, banks that have like research outputs will run seminars with the reporters where they bring them in, explain to them how this stuff works, how they can integrate it into their work. They have sort of like very professional media relations operations around that kind of thing. I think that's worth trying to replicate. And I think the one that's easiest is like tweet stuff at reporters. Like reporters are addicted to Twitter. Some of them are like maybe moving to Blue Sky. I don't know. Like follow them wherever they wind up going, but they don't want to do their jobs just as you don't want to do your job. And they'll be fucking around on there. Send them prediction markets, get in their faces about it. Some of them will get annoyed and write like columns about how prediction markets are neoliberal or whatever. But some of them will take it seriously, and some of them will like adjust things in response. So I think a heavy outreach phase is important at this moment. And also, I think getting some of the research out there. So I don't know, I alluded to it earlier, but I don't know how many people saw that the Commodities Future Trading Commission came out with a ruling today saying that Kalshi can't do real money bets on U.S. elections, that they ruled that was outside of their ambit. And there was a huge effort by some lefty senators to push them in this direction. So Jeff Merkley from Oregon, Liz Warren, a few other senators sent them letters like demanding that they not allow this to happen. And I said something on Twitter about how I thought this was bad, and a friend was just like, "Is there any research at all to suggest that these markets are useful? That they like tell you things about elections?" And like I say that here, and everyone's like, "No, of course they're useful." But like Tim's a smart guy; he just like doesn't know this stuff. And I think your FAQ on prediction markets is what I send to a lot of people to try to like get them up to speed on why this might be useful. But yeah, I think there's more to do in just sort of what actual like social science papers do we have indicating that these have like an enviable track record. Lay that out for people. Give them a sentence that they can include in the article and be like, well, this may seem kind of wacky. Wolfers 2004 suggests that kind of thing.
Okay. And so you said before that you thought it was 70% they hadn't heard of it, 30% institutional issues. I think your answer was about addressing that 70%
Sure.
haven't heard of it. What can we do to address the 30% institutional issues?
30% institutional issues. I think the impression that it's gambling motivates a lot of the pushback that I've noticed. I think that was motivating the sort of Merkley-Warren opposition to allowing it in elections, that sort of you're gambling with American democracy when American democracy is on the verge. And I think getting people to think of it less like gambling and more like the stock market is useful. Is the stock market not gambling? Like, fair enough. But like, we accept that there is this institution in our lives that is very important, where people make like speculative judgments with real money. And it's absurd and weird in various ways, but we accept that it is probably net good, that we have like public valuations of companies as opposed to like purely private, like not equilibrium, like low liquidity things. And so I think making that analogy clearer and tighter, and yeah, I think also some clarity on use cases can help people. And there are places where I could use more clarity too. Like I think one argument I've heard from some people is that prediction markets in cases of like electoral fraud can be useful. And like I can kind of see the intuition there, but like it would be useful if someone just like wrote a piece called like prediction markets are useful at detecting electoral fraud, and then I can link that and I can send and like maybe I write that post, maybe you write that post, maybe like someone in this room writes that post. But I think there's just like basic communications work like that can helpfully be persuasive. But yeah, it's also hard. I don't know. My copy editors edit everything. They read my stuff, but they also read like our reviews of movies and like scientific breakthroughs and yeah, they edit everything on the site. And so like I'm not going to get any of them to read like a meta-analysis of research on forecasting, but I think maybe you get to a point where it's not. I think the moment we're at right now is I've never heard of it, and so I don't care one way or another. I think my worry is that if there's enough work addressing the 70% that's just about people not knowing about it, that you get to a point where it's I've heard about it and I'm suspicious of it. And so I think like at that point you might like efforts to sort of change a general milieu so that people are not like instinctively hostile to it. And I should say here, I think they're useful. I think they're fun. I think a lot of this is unproven. Like we have that Wolfers paper from the mid-aughts. I'd love to see more work that is in the form of like put together research papers as opposed to like EA forum posts on track records here. And I think like that can go a long way in establishing sort of its credibility as a model.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, which is that I've sometimes had more luck introducing people to Metaculus than to any particular market, just because it's obviously not gambling. You're not going to go on there and see a question about rational Aussie on the front page. It looks professional, it's run by academics, so that's sometimes been helpful. But you're right, it sounds like there's a lot of suspicion. It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done. We're a little less than halfway through this panel.
Sure.
Do you want to take the interviewer role for a second, or should we open it up to questions?
I'm happy to open it up to questions for now, and then I can maybe intersperse some of my own throughout.
All right, sounds good.
Great. We have some questions, and again, I'm going to see if I can put them on the screen, and then you can unvote them as well. But I will just start. The current question, Juan, you've got a question about the base rate times. Maybe you want to stand up and ask that?
Yeah, so let me see if I recall precisely what the question was. It was something like, what do you think is the hope for having a major news outlet or having a current major news outlet like seriously integrate forecasts as part of their process in a way that's like more than monthly? Like maybe not everything has a forecast, but where there's at least like something that regularly has forecasts like natively built in. Do you see that as something that either like plausibly you could create a competitor to current news outlets that gets enough adoption for it to be relevant, or do you think there's hope for a current news outlet to actually like somehow integrate that really tightly in a way that's even more integrated than what maybe currently is happening with Vox, where you have some questions that are forecasted, but it's more of a kind of one-off thing?
Right. I wouldn't say we were tightly integrated at all. Yeah. So yeah, for this to be a good forecasting question, I should put a point probability on this. I'd say maybe. Oh my goodness. I gave the wrong answer. And maybe I would say like maybe. I think someone has already actually started a new site that's like trying to integrate this. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, I think this was.
Base rate times?
Is that what it's called? Yeah. Sort of, yeah. So like 100% that someone will try this. Maybe 10% that a dedicated site like that will be successful, because like almost no digital media sites are successful. And I think maybe 20% odds that it gets integrated in some way. And I think the model there is less. I think polling is really a good analogy here, or like box scores or things for sports. 538 has tried to be a website that is just about polling, and I think they did really, really good work. It just turns out that something that people mainly use every 4 years is like hard to make work as a business. And so I think the future of polling is like there being a widget on the New York Times homepage that like gives you polling averages or things. And I think similarly, I could imagine getting to a point where one or another outlet has something like that for sort of topics that are in the news. I'm trying to think of a good example of that right now. What's in the news this week? Okay. Government shutdown, yes. What are the odds that the government shuts down? That's actually a great example. Like I can imagine sort of there being a tally of like, what's the odds that the government shuts down? What are the odds that Ukraine puts troops in Crimea? What are the odds that there's another coup in Eastern Africa this month? Like that's something I could kind of imagine. Can I imagine getting that done at Vox in the next year? No, but like as a sort of longer term thing, yeah, I think that's imaginable.
So Clara Collier was supposed to be here tonight. She couldn't make it. She runs Asterisk magazine, which is kind of a rationalist EA adjacent magazine. She does this. She has prediction markets and forecasts in a lot of her articles. She usually has one article by a super forecaster, by something like, here's why I think the government probably will shut down, and then going through the forecasting steps, something like that. I think it's great. It has not produced a giant outpouring of support. Not to rag on Vox or anything, but I've seen a lot of stuff by Ezra and Matt, two of the founders of Vox, who say that they really tried to pitch it as like a much more intellectually difficult and rigorous media source than it eventually became. And what they found was that there just wasn't that much of a market for their like extremely detailed Vox-splainers, and that Ezra, I think, then like kind of did his podcast Into the Weeds, where he went deeper into things, but that the average Vox article was not going that deep. And I think that anybody who tries to start a new news source, which is just about forecasting, will find that people actually don't really want forecasts, even if they're correct. People want things that make them click a link on Facebook or on X, and look at the news. Are people really maximizing for correctness here? I think the answer is no, and I think the people who run these news organizations know that. I do think that people would be really excited in a lot of cases just for the context in their article, which may be written from some perspective or with some kind of ulterior motive, for useful information. Like, I think now I read like an article on Ukraine that says Ukraine's counterattack is actually better than we thought. And I want to see at the bottom the prediction market for whether it will succeed or not in the end. So I think there's a lot of demand for it. I don't think the right way to do that is, like, the base rate times is great. I'm glad it exists, but I don't think it's going to be that somebody defeats all existing news organizations with a forecasting-based news organization. I think that news organizations that already have this key skill of making people want to read them are going to find ways to integrate forecasting into that.
Yeah. I think there's also a lot of, I could talk forever about what went right or wrong in the early days of Vox, and probably no one would bore everyone here, but I think like one thing I've learned is that there's a lot of just like time fixed effects. When we started in 2014, I think like 80 to 90% of our readership was from Facebook. And so we tried to do these things called card stacks. I don't know if anyone was reading like a decade ago when we were trying to do this, but it was sort of like these hyper card style like lists of questions on big topics. And the problem was that none of them had pictures. And so if you're trying to share stuff on Facebook, it looked like dog shit. It was just like long paragraphs of text. And so no one wanted to share it, and so no one read it. 5 years later, when Mark Zuckerberg realized that the way to get rid of fake news was to just like make it hard to share any news, then our traffic sources shifted. And so for a while we were like 60, 70% Google. And those would have done great in that era. Like Google doesn't care about images nearly as much. It's people like researching topics. And so people like going to Google and being like, what is ISIS? And then like a bunch of cards about ISIS showing up is actually ideal. But like we weren't founded in 2019, we were founded in 2014. So we were sort of like built into an environment with a very particular set of incentives that evolved very rapidly.
The next question is from me, and that's just how the numbers work. Are there markets that you wish existed, like that you're like looking, that you sometimes you're like, oh, is there a market on this and there isn't? Like something you've repeatedly failed to find on a specific topic.
You're probably on the markets more than I am, so.
That question doesn't even parse, and this is why I'm so grateful for Manifold, is that whenever that happens, I just create the market.
Sure. I guess I more meant like betting markets where you're like, oh, I wish I would cite a liquid market on this topic, but it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think the liquid adjective I think is operative there. That I think because of Manifold, there are arbitrary markets for arbitrary things. I think, what are the things I find myself struggling with? Much of when I'm looking at this is when we're doing our annual predictions, and at the end of the year before the next year's Oscar predictions are a mess. And so if we can get like some busybodies in Hollywood to get into prediction markets and like make those markets more liquid so that I can like make some mana on predicting cinematography. It's like, it's all about the technical categories. That's how you like really win those pools. But do I have a serious answer? I think more regional international politics stuff outside of like China, Taiwan, we got, Ukraine, we got. I have been sort of taken aback by the wave of coups in Africa this summer, and that seems very important for human welfare. But I don't know anything about African politics, and I think the forecasting community is probably not optimized for knowledge there. But I think like greater regional political economic knowledge could be really useful. And I think to the point we were discussing earlier about sort of trying to predict sort of war and peace incidents and things, that seems like an area where there's not a lot of good quantitative data already. And so the marginal like improvement of having a good liquid forecasting market seems pretty high.
The next question is by Carson Gale. So Carson, if you want to stand up and give your question. I'm just going to read it then.
Oh, no.
Could you make a prediction in 5 years, what is the likelihood that 5% or more of news articles and reputable organizations reference prediction markets? Can I repeat that?
There's a lot of definitions there that I want to get pedantic about. There's like reputable, there's article, there's I mean, when you phrase it like that, 5% or more.
If you make a better version of the question that you think is getting to the thing that Carson.
No. I'm trying to steelman the question. Maybe 3%. I just like, there's a lot of news articles out there, man. Like there's newspapers in North Dakota. It's crazy.
Yeah, I'm going to say, regardless of how we operationalize the question, 1% or less, just because, I mean, I don't think it's true that 5% of the news articles?
Yeah.
Are we even sure that 5% of news articles reference polls now? Like, I think...
On
think,
politics, almost certainly not.
I think the answer is probably no, and it would surprise me if within 5 years prediction markets leapfrogged polls to become an even bigger source of newsworthiness. I would be delighted if any major news articles in like the really big papers referenced a prediction market for anything other than being about a prediction market. Like, I think there are some good articles on, hey, prediction markets, they exist. I think what we need to do is get people to start talking about prediction markets in articles about the object level news.
Matt C. Wilson, we've got a question for you.
Yeah, so Scott, you mentioned that the professionalism, kind of the meticulous, helps encourage, I guess, a degree of more credibility.
Yeah.
I'm going in the opposite direction. Does celebrity participation in prediction markets create a sense of buzz, or does it kind of create a sort of like, ooh, this is weird, exotic, questionable behavior that makes it seem sketchier? Kind of directing the question at both of you.
My guess would be it depends on the celebrity, and it's relatively low in either case. So I actually cannot remember whether Nate Silver bets on Manifold. I know he's here, so he must be interested in it. But I don't think anybody who wasn't already excited about prediction markets has said anything like, oh, Nate Silver is involved in a prediction market. And which makes me think that it's like he's very famous and very respected for forecasting. So it makes me doubt that anybody else would create that much more buzz. I think if you could get like Elon Musk or Joe Biden, that would probably be some buzz. But I think below that level, it probably doesn't matter all that much.
It's so funny to me to imagine Joe Biden using the Manifold app. I mean, he could be great. I don't know. He one of my favorite like early Biden administration stories is he got like the CIA to get him a special Peloton that wouldn't send his data to China because he's like so addicted to his Peloton that it was like not viable. Yes, this is how we're going to figure it out. In a week?
I never do those times.
You never do
My
close.
markets aren't very well written.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly like, it really feels like in the is brand awareness phase of things now, and so I think it's mostly positive. Like, outside of like rationalist EA world, most of the people I know who know about manifold markets have heard about it from James Medlock, who I don't know, some people might know, but he's like a sort of social democrat-y, lefty Twitter personality, pseudonymous Twitter personality, who will like post manifold markets on like, will the feral cat in my neighborhood let me pet her? When will she let me pet her? and stuff like that. And so like I think like it's hard to know. And I think that one was actually pretty well, like I think it got it right. She warmed up to him.
Are you saying the cat's opinion was influenced by the market?
I'm saying that there was no one who had inside information on the cat and its temperament who failed to bid in the market because they were leaving mana on the table. So I think that was almost purely a positive experience. I don't know if people's takeaway from that was like, this is a serious data source that I should integrate into my like news gathering regimen, but they had heard of manifold markets, and that's half the battle.
Yeah, actually, I want to slightly amend my answer. I've been too focused on celebrity participation as embedding in the markets. I think there's a big role for celebrities in promoting the markets. I know that the video logger Destiny has gotten a lot of his community involved in those markets, and it's been really useful. So if somebody, like, I get the impression that like 5 to 10% of people on Manifold are there because of Destiny, and if one video logger can have that effect, then I think there's a lot of room for somebody else to have that size of an effect, and for many more people to have that size of effect. So I think I want to amend my answer to, if they really do a good job promoting it, and they have associated communities where they can all become part of it as a community, then I think that's great. I think if it's just they're playing on it, then it's maybe not as great.
Yeah, and especially like early like exponential growth phase. Like I remember when Twitter was new and like it was the thing Ashton Kutcher was on. There was a period where he was like the one celebrity who would post on Twitter, and that like got people into it. And so like maybe Destiny is the Ashton Kutcher of Manifold.
I don't know whether he'll thank you for that.
I don't know.
But the next question is also from me. Guys, you can add more questions. There's the QR code there. Come on, you can do better than this. But what article, if you can think of one, has had most impact on your life, or a lot of impact on your life?
What article?
Like a blog article that you've read. You know, can you think of a time when journalism has really had like a crystalline, clear impact on your life?
You don't want to know about the article that had the most effect on my life.
I really do, but maybe not enough. Second most, third most.
It took me a second, but they're gross answers. I once like told someone that the movie that had the most influence on my life was The Last Emperor, because there's a scene where the deposed emperor of China is like in a Maoist prison camp, and he's like peeing into the center of a bucket and hitting the pee, and it's really loud, and someone's like, you pee on the side, it's quieter. And that's really changed my life. And I think like in a really durable, everyday kind of way. What's the real answer? I think that, yeah, I should probably just like pick. There's a lot of them. So one is a book that is out of print, and I'm trying to get it back into print. So, but it's by a journalist, so I think it's just like it's a long article. But it's a book called Gang of Five by Nina Easton, which is it's a group biography of 5 conservative activists who came of age in the 80s and became very influential. So it's Bill Kristol, Grover Norquist, Ralph Reed, Clint Bollock, and David McIntosh, the last 2 of whom are like obscure but secretly very powerful. And I think that was it sort of helped me formulate a model of politics where it was not like the mass emotions of the public, but it was like there are actual people, many of whom you will never hear of, like quietly pursuing things that they deeply believe in sort of Machiavellian ways, but at times like inspiringly idealistic ways. Like Grover Norquist truly hates taxes. He is not in it for the money. And I think that sort of has influenced about a lot of how I think about politics as an activity. I'm trying to think of like a really classic blog post that isn't by you, so I don't seem like a suck up. Do you have a number 2 choice?
I'm actually going to pass on this one. I was going to say one by you, but I feel like at this point this is just...
We can name our favorite thing by each other.
Let's
just name our favorite by each other. All right. All right.
So next one is Louis. If you want to go to your...
All right. How big is the risk of popularizing prediction markets and news articles leading to intentional distortion of them?
Yeah, so that relates to the general question of how easy it is or isn't to distort prediction markets, which I think depends a lot on kind of technical details. I think it's really hard to distort a big real money prediction market. It's somewhat easier to, I believe, and there are lots of meticulous people in the audience, so tell me if I'm wrong. I think if you want to register a bunch of fake accounts, it's somewhat easy to distort the meticulous community prediction, but not their official prediction, and the community prediction is probably the easiest one for journalists to find. So
in some questions, meticulous stops new accounts counting. So on some of the Russian nuclear questions, they made it so new accounts didn't actually affect that. So
all right, that's great. Then that also makes it hard to influence. And then I think on Manifold, we've seen that you can just do kind of a new account ratchet and do somewhat well for yourself, at least for a while. I think it's kind of yet to be tested in one of these situations. I think it's possible that, like, it depends on what time period we're talking about. Do you want to screw it up for 2 minutes so you can take a screenshot and then put that on your article? Or do you want to screw it up if people have become accustomed to checking it an hour later when they hear about it? And I think that probably it is very hard but doable, but I think there are people who understand the technicalities more in the audience.
I would broadly agree with that, yeah.
Great. Juan, there's another question from you here about the difference between citing prediction market and a pundit.
Yeah, so like you mentioned earlier that sometimes it's easier to either sell a certain source to your editor or cite it if it seemed more official. And when it comes to forecasting the future, prediction markets are one way of aggregating lots of different forecasts, but another way is just to find a good forecaster who has a good track record. Do you see there being a difference in tractability for doing that as a way to add forecasts into news?
Okay, so first I want to give a second answer to your question that I just thought of. A couple months ago, I was interested in this question, so I took a random question, which happened to be, will Austin Chen be convicted of a felony? And I tried, it was like at 2% or something. I tried to just increase it as high as I could, and I have like 30,000 mana. They gave me a lot of mana for helping support them at the beginning, so I have a lot of money. And I just put as much as I could into this market, and I think I raised it up to 8%. I couldn't raise it any higher than that, and then it was down back to 2, like a couple hours later. So it's pretty hard even for something that nobody really cares about. So that's my story. Maybe Austin cares. That's my story. But to answer your question, yeah, I think one of the great things that forecasting can do is kind of spread the concept of super forecasters, spread the idea that it is possible to grade how people are doing, and maybe instead of listening to people with really good hair and suits, we should listen to the people who get really high grades and these kinds of things. I think that suffers from the same kind of problems as anything else about prediction markets, which is if a journalist says, so-and-so, who is a super forecaster, said that this would happen, then their editor has to know what a super forecaster is and believe that the readers would know what a super forecaster is, generally care about this, whereas if you said, according to Nate Silver, everybody would know exactly what you're talking about. So I think this is a very long-term project. I think it's spreading. Again, I want to praise Asterisk Magazine, which does their interview with the super forecaster every issue. But I think it's going to be a long-term project.
I'll particularly call out the one with Jonathan Mann in the AI issue on sort of trying to forecast job loss or displacement from generative AI. That was, just for me as someone who's like trying to get better at forecasting, it was a good like step-by-step guide of how someone who's good at this like lays out forecasts. To Juan's question, yeah, I think there's a kind of respectability gap that you sometimes need to bridge. I think a good example of this was there's a guy, Elon Levy, who is a bit of a Twitter personality, but knows more about why transit systems cost more or less in different countries and cities than anyone else I know. When he started posting about this, he was just like a math PhD student, and it was like weird as a reporter to be like, math PhD student Elon Levy, who knows a lot about this, says, but then like he got a like resident scholar at like the Furman Center for such and such, and then it was like resident scholar for, it suddenly became, and like, yeah, it's kind of arbitrary, but like such is life. And so I think part of why I'm excited about the existence of the Forecasting Research Institute is if, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, if is it Samutskevi? If those guys like all are just like senior fellows at something called like the Forecasting Research Institute, that makes it so much easier for me to, as opposed to I'm just like, there's this group with a vaguely Russian name, and they're good at predicting stuff. I promise they're not scammers. Yeah, so yeah, sometimes just that veneer is useful.
Great. The next question is by Etirabis. I apologize if I'm mauling that one. This is this question here. Also, it's possibly in a non-account, so if someone doesn't stand up in like 5 seconds, I'm just going to read it. Is somebody going to say it? I'm not seeing that. So the question is, what do you consider the best solution to prediction markets have arbitrary resolution being an obstacle to institutional uptake? How do you solve that problem of the arbitrary resolution?
To some degree, this seems like a technical mechanism design question that's way above my pay grade, but I think the easiest ones I would have to sell to people are ones where there are like reputable institutions doing the resolution. So like, if like the AP was resolving a bunch of election predictions because they call elections anyway, or decision.xhq or something like that, if JP Morgan was resolving a bunch of economic ones, I think that makes it easier just operationally for me, but I don't know if that's the best way to resolve it as a technical question or for accuracy of the markets.
Yeah, so this is another case where I think Metaculus has an advantage over some other groups just because they resolve all of their things and they're known to be honest and have good criteria. In practice, I haven't talked to a lot of people who know enough about prediction markets to even have that as a question, and that's also where they're hung up on.
So I'm just going to offer that we've got sort of about 5 minutes left. We could do some more of these. I'm choosing this point because, again, mine is the next one, so I'm going to say we're hitting the bottom of the barrel. But also, maybe you guys have some like closing questions you'd like to ask each other,
Yeah.
or like something this has made you think about.
I don't know. What should I do with like my life, Scott?
Future Perfect seems pretty good.
Okay.
I don't know. There aren't a
good.
lot of other things like it. And I think one of the things that I got out of this session, and people always say it, and it's always hard for me to update on, is the importance of officialness. Like, a guy who is very smart and forecasts things well is not news. A guy who is smart and forecasts things well and is a senior fellow is news. And I think Future Perfect does a really great job being in an official group that covers a lot of the same topics that someone might cover on the EA forum. But because you have so much prestige behind your name, it makes it actually important. I still remember my parents at one point being like, there was a Vox podcast about that AI stuff you sometimes talk about. I was like, yes, there was.
I
And, like,
believe
before
that
that,
podcast
it
was interviewing Jan Tallinn, and when I asked every question I asked Jan about why he believed in it, he was like, "Have you read the Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationale?"
Right. It's not real until a reporter has said they've read it.
Right.
That's the important thing. So I'm very grateful to you and everyone at Future Perfect. Better you than me having to work within that system, but I think you do a great job, and that's what I want to end the journalism panel on, is the importance of official journalism towards any kind of movement, whether it's prediction markets or AI safety or anything else, is they are the people we launder our ideas through, and they do a great job of it.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander.